"Get on the ground, old man." The young officer's voice cracked like a whip in the sterile quiet of the VA hospital exit lobby, slicing through the murmur of hushed conversations and the distant beep of medical equipment. Arthur Jenkins, all 78 years of his life etched into the stoop of his shoulders and the tremor in his hands, flinched. He leaned heavily on a worn wooden cane, his other hand clutching the strap of a faded canvas bag that had seen better decades. His eyes, clouded with the dull film of age and the exhaustion of a tiring VA appointment, widened not in defiance, but in slow, dawning confusion. He tried to turn, to comprehend the source of the aggressive command, his movements ponderous and unsteady. I don't understand, officer," he began, his voice raspy, barely audible. The officer, young, crisp in his uniform, radiating impatient energy that bordered on aggression, saw only an old man failing to comply. Perhaps a vagrant, perhaps someone disoriented and unpredictable. "I said on the ground. Last warning." Before Arthur could process the escalating threat, before he could articulate another plea for understanding, the sharp, vicious crackle of a taser erupted in the confined space. A blinding, searing pain shot through Arthur's frail body. His legs buckled. His cane clattered uselessly to the polished linoleum. He crumpled, a heap of worn tweed and bewildered agony, onto the cold floor. The faded canvas bag skittered away, its contents spilling slightly. 6 minutes. Just 6 minutes later, the entire sprawling Veterans Affairs Hospital complex would be in an unprecedented state of lockdown. Every door sealed, every corridor patrolled, all because of what lay inside that bag and inside the memory of the man now gasping on the floor. If you believe that every person, especially those who have served, deserves to be treated with fundamental dignity, type honor in the comments below. Arthur Jenkins had walked out of the ophthalmology department with a sigh, the bright lights of the clinic still making his old eyes water. Another appointment ticked off. Another reassurance that the slow fade of his vision was, for now, manageable. His world was shrinking, both in sight and in scope. He lived a quiet life in a small apartment, subsisting on a meager pension and the memories that were sometimes a comfort, sometimes a torment. He was a man of routine, of quiet habits. His visits to the VA were a pillar of that routine, a necessary pilgrimage. He didn't speak much to the staff beyond pleasantries, never mentioned the wars, the medals, the men he'd led, the life he'd given. Why would he? It was a lifetime ago. Today he was just an old man, tired. His back ached. His thoughts were already on the bus ride home and the simple meal he'd prepare. He clutched his bag, a repository of his immediate needs, a bottle of water, a half-eaten sandwich, his reading glasses, and tucked deep within the papers that were both his burden and his only remaining proof of a life spent in service. He was almost at the main exit, the automatic doors hissing open to reveal a gray, drizzly afternoon, when the sharp, accusatory voice shattered his fragile peace. He had no context for the aggression, no understanding of what he could have possibly done to warrant such a command. His mind, already slowed by age and fatigue, struggled to catch up with the sudden, terrifying shift in reality. One moment, he was anticipating the familiar scent of rain. The next, an invisible force was tearing through him. Officer Miller, barely. 2 years on the force, assigned to the VA hospital's peripheral security detail, felt a surge of adrenaline. He'd seen the old man loitering near the exit, looking to Miller's inexperienced eyes, shifty and out of place. Miller, eager to prove his vigilance, had approached. The old man's slow reaction, his mumbled confusion, had tripped Miller's internal alarm wires, which were tuned more to procedure than to empathy. Non-compliance. Potential threat. He'd followed his training, or so he believed. Now, standing over the fallen figure, taser still aimed, Miller felt a flicker of something, uncomfortable beneath the adrenaline. Doubt, perhaps. But he squashed it. He was in control. "Suspect is down," he barked into his shoulder mic. "Requesting assistance. Main south entrance." His voice was steady, professional, betraying none of the chaos now erupting around him. Few bystanders gasped. A nurse halfway through the lobby froze, her hand flying to her mouth. The thud of Arthur's body, the sight of an elderly man being tasered, sent a ripple of shock and fear through the usually calm environment. Arthur lay on the floor, the world a painful, blurry mess. The taser's barbs had caught him in the thin fabric of his coat, the electricity coursing through his already protesting muscles. Each breath was a ragged, shallow gasp. He tasted blood, a coppery tang from biting his tongue. Dimly, he was aware of people gathering, voices murmuring, the officer's stern commands. He tried to push himself up, a primal instinct to escape the pain, but his limbs wouldn't obey. His faded canvas bag lay a few feet away, its strap broken, some of its contents spilled. A small worn leather-bound journal, a plastic bottle of pills, and a single folded sheet of official-looking paper, slightly creased, that had slid partially out. It was this paper, innocuous to most, that would change everything. Officer Miller, focused on subduing his suspect, moved to cuff Arthur, roughly, pulling one arm behind his back. Arthur groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure misery. "Just stay down, old-timer," Miller grunted, misinterpreting the sound as resistance. He was young, full of the certainty that often accompanies inexperience, blind to the nuances of the situation, deaf to the silent story the old man's presence told. A senior nurse, Maria Rodriguez, who had rushed forward despite Miller's bark to stay back, saw the spilled contents. Her eyes, trained to observe details, snagged on the partially exposed document. It wasn't the type of paper one usually carried. It looked like an old military commendation, the letterhead faded, but distinct. Then she saw the journal, open to a page with a faded photograph tucked inside. A much younger Arthur, lean and hard in a uniform she didn't recognize but knew, was from a bygone era, standing with a group of other soldiers, all of them smiling with the bravado of youth facing the unknown. It was the look in the young Arthur's eyes, a fierce, unwavering determination that resonated with something, ancient and profound, but it was something else, a small, almost invisible detail that truly caught her breath. Tucked into the binding of the journal, almost falling out, was a tarnished silver star. Small, unassuming, yet radiating an undeniable significance. Maria had family in the military. She knew what that star often meant. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't just an elderly patient. This was something more. "Officer," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "Officer, wait. Look at this." Miller, annoyed by the interruption, glanced dismissively at the nurse, then at the scattered items. He saw nothing but an old man's trinkets. "Ma'am, this is an active situation. Please step away." But Maria held her ground. "No, you don't understand," she insisted, her voice rising with urgency. That man. You need to see who he is." She knelt carefully, her hand hovering over the silver star, then pointed to the folded document. Arthur, barely conscious, heard her voice as if from a great distance. A single word, a name, escaped his lips, a broken whisper. "Eleanor? Tell Eleanor." It was a name from his past, a name tied to promises made in the crucible of war. The chaos was escalating. More security personnel were arriving, their expressions grim. But Maria, fueled by a sudden fierce conviction, pushed past them. She knew the hospital director, Dr. Evans, was in a meeting on the 3rd floor. She also knew his direct line, and that he was a decorated veteran himself. She didn't hesitate. Pulling out her phone, her fingers fumbling, she punched in the number. "Director Evans," she said, her voice tight, with suppressed panic when his secretary answered. "This is Maria Rodriguez from Lobby South. It's an emergency. A code red. You need to come down now. It's about a patient and an incident, a serious one." Dr. Alistair Evans, a retired Army colonel, now heading one of the largest VA hospitals in the region, was a man who commanded respect through quiet authority and decisive action. When his usually unflappable senior nurse called his direct line, bypassing all protocol and speaking with such uncharacteristic urgency, he knew it was critical. He ended his budget meeting abruptly, his curt apology leaving his stunned colleagues mid-sentence. "What's the situation, Maria?" he asked, already striding toward the elevator, his long legs covering the ground with military efficiency. Maria's voice was a torrent of information. The tasing, the elderly patient, the spilled bag, the silver star, the name Eleanor. Each word struck Evans with increasing force. When she mentioned the tarnished star and the name, a cold dread mixed with an almost unbelievable flicker of recognition gripped him. There were not many men who fit that profile. Men who had earned that particular star in that particular conflict. Men connected to an Eleanor in the context Maria was frantically describing. He knew of one, a legend. A ghost, a man most believed long dead, or at least lost to the annals of history. "Lock down the south wing," Evans commanded into his own comms unit as the elevator doors opened on the ground floor. "No one in or out. Secure the lobby." "I'm on my way." He didn't wait for an answer. He moved with a speed that belied his 50-odd years, his mind racing. Could it truly be him, after all these decades? The scene that greeted him in the south lobby was one of controlled chaos. Officer Miller stood defiantly over the prone figure of Arthur Jenkins, who was now barely moving. Two other security officers were attempting to disperse a growing crowd of concerned onlookers. Maria was near Arthur, her face pale, trying to shield him. Evans's arrival cut through the tension like a hot knife. His presence, his aura of command, was palpable. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "Officer Miller," his voice was low, dangerously calm. Miller, startled, spun around, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm before realizing who had spoken. He snapped to attention, or as close as his agitated state would allow. "Sir, Director Evans." Suspect was non-compliant, potentially hostile. Evans didn't let him finish. He strode past Miller, his gaze fixed on the crumpled figure on the floor. He knelt, his expensive suit creasing on the cold linoleum, his eyes scanning Arthur's face, then the spilled contents of the bag. He saw the tarnished star, the faded commendation, the journal. His breath hitched. The lines on the old man's face, the weariness in his posture, couldn't completely erase the ghost of the young warrior Evans knew from black and white photographs and whispered battlefield. "Stories." "Arthur," he breathed, his voice incredulous, laced with a profound, almost reverent respect. "Arthur Jenkins, is that you?" Arthur's eyelids fluttered through a haze of pain and disorientation. He heard his name spoken with a tone he hadn't heard in decades, a tone of recognition, of respect, almost of awe. He tried to focus on the face above him, a face that seemed both stern and kind. "Evans," he whispered. The name a question, a flicker of a memory from a briefing long ago. A younger officer, perhaps attached to a command he dimly recalled. Dr. Evans nodded slowly, his eyes, the eyes of a man who had also seen conflict, now filled with an emotion that stunned the onlookers into silence. It was a mixture of disbelief, profound sorrow for Arthur's current state, and an overwhelming, surging respect. He reached out a hand, not to restrain, but to gently touch Arthur's shoulder. "It's Alistair Evans, sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion. We thought you were—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The legends surrounding Arthur Jenkins, particularly the circumstances of his final classified mission, were a closed book, a file sealed and buried deep. Officer Miller, watching this exchange, felt the ground beneath him begin to shift. The hospital director, a man known for his iron composure, was kneeling on the floor, addressing this old vagrant as Sir something. Was terribly, terribly wrong with Miller's assessment of the situation. The air crackled with unspoken questions. The other security officers exchanged uneasy glances. Maria Rodriguez let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Evans carefully picked up the tarnished silver star. He held it in his palm, its weight far exceeding its size. "This," he began, his voice now carrying across the suddenly silent lobby, "is Captain Arthur Jenkins, hero of Hill 488, sole survivor of Operation Nightshade, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 silver stars, this being one of them, and 3 Purple Hearts." Evans's voice grew stronger with each word, each decoration a testament to a bravery that was almost beyond comprehension. He then picked up the faded commendation. "This document," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the security personnel and the gathered staff, "is a direct citation from General Westmoreland himself, detailing an act of valor so extraordinary it was classified for over 30 years. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Captain Jenkins," Evans said, turning back to Arthur, his voice now imbued with a deep, unwavering reverence, single-handedly held off an enemy battalion for 72 hours, wounded multiple times, protecting his surrounded and injured men until reinforcements could arrive. He saved 32 lives that day at the cost of almost everything he had. He looked directly at Officer Miller, his eyes like chips of ice. This man is not a suspect. This man is a national hero, a living legend. And you, officer, you tasered him. The revelation hung in the air, thick and heavy as unshed tears. Officer Miller's face, moments before flushed with the arrogance of authority, had drained of all color. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. The taser, which he still held loosely, suddenly felt like a lead weight, a brand of his own monumental ignorance. He stared at Arthur Jenkins, truly seeing him for the first time, not as an uncooperative old man, but as the figure Dr. Evans described, a warrior, a protector, a man who had walked through hell and back. The crisp uniform, the badge, the perceived power he wielded, all felt like a cheap costume in the face of Arthur's silent, battered dignity. The other security officers looked down, ashamed. Bystanders whispered, their initial fear replaced by awe and a dawning horrified understanding of what they had witnessed. Dr. Evans carefully helped Arthur to sit up, cradling his elbow. "Captain Arthur," he said gently, "we need to get you to the ER, get you checked out. I am so profoundly sorry for what happened here. This is inexcusable." Arthur, still weak, managed a faint nod. The pain was still intense, but a different kind of sensation was beginning to filter through the fog, a sense of being seen, truly seen, after decades of existing in the shadows of his own past. He looked at Dr. Evans, a flicker of the old fire, briefly illuminating his tired eyes. "Just a misunderstanding, Colonel," he rasped, the ingrained habit of downplaying his own suffering still present. "It happens." Evans shook his head. "No, sir. This doesn't just happen. Not here. Not to you. Not to any veteran." He turned his attention back to Miller, his voice dropping to a glacial calm that was far more terrifying than any shout. "Officer Miller, you will hand over your weapon and your badge to Sergeant Davis." He indicated one of the senior security guards. "You're suspended. Effective immediately. Pending a full investigation, you will be escorted to my office, and you will wait there." Miller, visibly trembling, fumbled with his belt. The click of the taser being placed on the floor, followed by the unfastening of his badge, echoed in the stunned silence. I didn't know, sir," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "I was following procedure." "Your procedure?" Evans cut him off, his voice laced with cold fury, "failed to include discernment, respect, or basic human decency. You judged a man by his worn coat and his slow movements, not by the content of his character or the legacy of his service. You will have ample time to reflect on that. Medical personnel, alerted by Evans, arrived with a gurney. Arthur, despite his protests that he could walk, was gently helped onto it. As he was wheeled away, Dr. Evans stood ramrod straight, his hand raised in a slow, perfect salute. One by one, other staff members, veterans themselves, or those who understood the significance of the moment, also saluted. The lobby of the VA hospital, a place of healing and remembrance, became, for a few solemn moments, a testament to a hero rediscovered in the most painful of ways. It was then, as Arthur was being carefully maneuvered through the doors toward the emergency wing, that Dr. Evans gave the order that resonated through the entire facility. This is Director Evans. His voice broadcast over the hospital's PA system, amplified, yet still retaining its grave authority. Due to an ongoing critical incident and to ensure the dignity and security of a highly distinguished veteran, I am ordering an immediate Level 4 lockdown of the entire hospital complex. All external doors will be sealed. All non-essential movement between departments is to cease. Security will patrol all corridors. This lockdown will remain in effect until further notice. I repeat, the entire VA hospital is now under Level 4 lockdown. The announcement sent a new wave of shock and speculation through the building. But it also served a clear purpose. Evans wanted to control the narrative, to ensure Arthur Jenkins received the privacy and respect he deserved while they dealt with the fallout. He wanted to make it unequivocally clear that an attack on one veteran, especially one of Arthur's stature, was an attack on the very principles the VA stood for. It was a signal that this incident would not be swept under the rug. Within minutes, the usually bustling hospital fell into an eerie quiet. Doors were locked, blinds drawn. The lockdown also served to contain Officer Miller, symbolically and practically, ensuring he couldn't simply walk away. The investigation, Evans vowed silently, would be swift, thorough, and transparent. Changes would be made. Training protocols would be overhauled. This would not happen again. In the aftermath, as Arthur was being treated for bruises, muscle trauma, and the effects of the taser, Dr. Evans sat by his bedside. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a quiet sorrow and a fierce protectiveness. He had already initiated calls to the Pentagon, alerting them to Captain Jenkins's status and location. The news would ripple through very high echelons. For Officer Miller, the wait in Evans's office was agonizing. The silence was accusatory. Every tick of the clock was a hammer blow against his crumbling self-assurance. When Evans finally entered, hours later, his face was grim. The conversation was brief, brutal, and to the point. Miller's career in law enforcement was over. More than that, he would have to live with the knowledge of what he had done, the shame of having assaulted a man whose boots he wasn't worthy to polish. Evans also mandated that Miller undergo intensive sensitivity training and spend mandatory volunteer hours working directly with elderly and disabled veterans, not as a punishment, but as a path, however long, toward understanding and perhaps, eventually, some form of redemption. The lockdown was lifted late that evening, but the atmosphere within the VA hospital remained charged, changed. Word had spread like wildfire. The identity of the old man, the heroism, the injustice. There was a palpable sense of collective shame among some, but also a renewed sense of purpose. Arthur Jenkins, resting in a private room, his old canvas bag placed carefully on the nightstand, found himself the recipient of a stream of quiet, respectful visitors. Nurses checked on him more often than strictly necessary, their eyes filled with a new understanding. Doctors who weren't even on his case stopped by to offer words of support. A young soldier, an amputee from a recent conflict, wheeled himself in and simply sat in silence for a few minutes, then nodded at Arthur and left. A shared unspoken bond passing between them. Dr. Evans had arranged for Arthur's few belongings to be retrieved from his small apartment. He also discovered that Arthur's only surviving relative, a niece named Eleanor, the namesake of the woman Arthur had whispered about, his beloved wife, who had passed years ago, lived several states away. Evans made the call himself, explaining the situation gently. Eleanor, shocked and tearful, promised to be on the first flight out. Later that night, Evans sat with Arthur again. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of medical equipment. "Arthur," Evans said softly, "we found your service records, the complete file. It was sealed for reasons of national security, even the parts about your commendations. It seems very few people knew the full extent of your service after Operation Nightshade." Arthur nodded slowly. "Easier that way. Less complicated," Evans conceded. "But your story, Captain, it needs to be told. Not for glory, but for inspiration, for the new generation who need to understand what sacrifice truly means." Arthur was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. Then he looked at Evans, a faint smile touching his lips. "Maybe," he said, his voice stronger now. "Maybe you're right, Alistair." The use of Evans's first name was a quiet acknowledgement, a bridge across the years and the ranks. The connection, forged in the shared understanding of service and sacrifice, was palpable. For Arthur, the physical pain of the tasing would eventually fade. But the emotional impact of being seen, of being acknowledged after so long, was a balm to wounds far older, far deeper. He was no longer just a forgotten old soldier. He was Captain Arthur Jenkins, a hero, a man whose quiet dignity had finally, albeit painfully, been recognized. The incident at the VA hospital became a catalyst for significant change. Dr. Evans, true to his word, spearheaded a comprehensive review of security protocols and use of force policies, not just within his hospital, but advocating for similar reviews nationwide. New training programs were implemented, emphasizing de-escalation, empathy, and specific techniques for interacting with elderly veterans and those suffering from PTSD or cognitive impairments. Officer Miller, stripped of his position, began his long, arduous journey of community service and mandatory counseling. It was a humbling, eye-opening experience, forcing him to confront his biases and the devastating consequences of his actions. He would never wear a uniform again. But there was a flicker of hope that he might one day understand the true meaning of service and respect. Arthur Jenkins, once he recovered, did not return to his solitary apartment. His niece Eleanor arrived, and after hearing the full story and seeing the outpouring of respect for her uncle, insisted he come live with her and her family. For the first time in decades, Arthur found himself part of a loving, bustling household. His days filled not with lonely routine, but with the laughter of grandnieces and nephews and the quiet comfort of belonging. Dr. Evans made sure Arthur's full story, with appropriate redactions for national security, was unsealed and shared. A small, dignified ceremony was held at the VA, where Arthur, no longer in a worn tweed coat but in a borrowed suit that still couldn't quite contain the warrior within, was formally recognized. The tarnished silver star, now polished and gleaming, was pinned to his lapel by a visiting four-star general, an old friend of Evans, who had known of Jenkins's legend. The young officer's cruel words, "Get on the ground, old man," were replaced by words of profound gratitude and honor. The lingering image of that day was not of Arthur crumpled on the floor, but of him standing tall, albeit with the help of his cane and his niece's arm, accepting the long overdue accolades with quiet humility. His eyes, though still clouded by age, shone with a light that had been rekindled. He became a quiet advocate, speaking occasionally to new recruits at the VA. His presence, a powerful reminder that heroes often walk among us unseen, unassuming, deserving of our utmost respect. The lesson was clear. Never judge a book by its cover, for within the most weathered bindings can reside stories of unimaginable courage and sacrifice. The entire building had been locked down, but in the end, it was hearts and minds that were truly opened. we must always remember the debt we owe to those who have served. Their sacrifices, seen and unseen, shape the very fabric of our freedom. If their stories move you, if their courage inspires you, subscribe to Hidden Sparks for more narratives that honor their legacy. And always, always choose respect. Type respect if you agree.